And what we have here, the average score for this assessment, module 2, was 4.25 points. Now that's still a healthy.
Are you supposed to be showing us the screen?
Oh, hold on. There we go. Thank you, Lanaya. Okay, can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Now, as we progress through the semester, things get more and more difficult and more challenging. So the average score on this one was 4.25 points out of 5. That's the equivalent of an 85 average. That's still a very solid result for a first attempt. It shows that students are understanding and are able to negotiate scenarios and answer questions about concepts and methods, and that's really good. Now it's going to be interesting to see how the scores on the solutions, the hands-on, track with this, right? So assessments are about concepts and ideas, and then the solution is about the hands-on part. I've noticed that in some of my classes, students are not as quick to complete the solutions, and that's where we're having some folks behind. But in terms of the breakout, here's a matter of concern, right? So with a first attempt, I'd like to see students taking nearly the allotted time to complete the assessment. This was a challenging assessment from the perspective that there were 28 questions, right? And you had 60 minutes, so you had about 2 minutes per question. And students took 41 minutes to complete their first attempt. There were 15 easy questions, 10 medium questions, and 3 hard questions. That was a good mix for difficulty. But we did have some real solid results with some of the items on the assessment where all students answered in the same manner and in an identical manner, and they were probably correct, which is why we have the cannot calculate poor questions here listed, because there's no discrimination between student answers. There weren't any differences between student answers. They were all the same, and in many cases they were correct. That's why we had a higher average score. I just wanted to walk through that explanation one more time in case you were not present the first time we did this. So let's go ahead and dive into the areas that were the most challenging, and we may skip after a point when we get down to the lower part of the screen, especially where we'll likely skip each of these. Cannot calculate, but run up to about here, I think, personnel and physical inputs, outputs. So the first item that posed a challenge for students on this assessment was a multiple choice question about the TVA worksheet. Does anyone remember what the TVA initials stand for? Anyone? TVA? I'm gonna wait for it. I'm gonna wait for it. What does the T stand for? Threats? Hello? The V stands for vulnerabilities, which we call, what do we call vulnerabilities? What's the E word I want everybody to use instead? Did I lose audio? Is there
Exploits.
Well, exploits is an E word, yes, and it is related. I would prefer that everybody think in terms of exploits instead of threats. When you frame a cybersecurity scenario, if you keep it very basic, that there's an advantage to that. At least when you're conducting your initial review of a scenario, right? So you have exposures, and exposures are vulnerabilities, right? The fancy textbook word is vulnerability, but exposure is a more complex and comprehensive word for purposes of other cybersecurity disciplines. And when you talk about threats, you're talking about an individual who knows a given exploit, which is intended to take advantage of a given exposure, right? So it's keyed to a specific exposure, and a threat has to be capable. They have to know about the exploit. They have to know that there's an exposure. They have to be in the mix, in the environment, in order to be able to utilize the exploit against that exposure. And they may or may not be interested, right? So having a threat in the, it's like having a shark in the water. Does everybody worry about getting eaten alive when there's a shark in the water? Well, not if there's other fish, right? If there's other fish that a shark would rather eat, nobody worries about it. An attack, so an exploit is a method of compromise in that sense, right? Now, when the threat is active, you have the threat becomes a malicious actor who is conducting an active attack. And that's a different, so that's like the ultimate level of engagement there, right? And you're going to see a lot of different terms thrown around. The key to this worksheet is that you're taking the threats, the exposures for a given asset, and you're putting them on one sheet. And what matters is whether or not you have something of value you need to protect. You're not exposed if you don't have anything of value you need to protect. If that's the case, you're not really exposed, right? So the idea is to identify your assets, identify the exposures for those assets, and identify the threats or exploits. And that's a complex picture, right? So there might be a very common, very well-known exploit for a given asset, and it's in YouTube videos everywhere. Oh my gosh, you can change the first account exposure. Oh, somebody forgot their first password they set up on their Windows machine. And how do they get in there? How do they change this? How do they reload Windows? They can't, they're locked out. No, they aren't. There's like 10 different YouTube videos on how to crack the original administrative password with a very simple method. It's painfully simple. And that's like, so that would be an exploit that's very well known. And whether or not you have somebody skilled enough in the neighborhood, that's, so that T is actually a pretty complex, multifaceted aspect. All right. So in the TVA worksheet, assets are placed into a matrix with threats, and then the exposure of the assets to specific threats is explored by documenting the value. So ultimately, okay, I'm going to double check this because everybody answered vulnerabilities. But remember I said, think in terms of the word exposure. Vulnerabilities means the same as exposure. Okay, so that cannot, in logical terms, that cannot be the answer that's expected here. Okay. The main benefit of a TVA worksheet is that it gets everything you need to start assessing what you need to understand about your assets. And a common word that's used associated with assets is value. You're documenting the value of your assets alongside the exposures and the threats so that the stakeholders can make a decision. Now, that may not have been called out in class plainly and painfully enough, but we're doing it now. And that's one reason why we give people opportunities to retake the assessments. If that wasn't stated verbatim in that manner before, there you have it. Any questions about this item?
No questions.
Okay. Think in terms of that worksheet. It's valuable. It's valuable, hint, hint, because it gives the finance and administrative people the information they need to make decisions based on the value of the asset, right? And then they can say, okay, yeah, we obviously have a high risk situation here, right? Okay, then. So the next item that posed a significant challenge for students, understanding the blank context means understanding the impact of elements such as the business environment, the legal regulatory compliance environment, as well as the threat environment. So this is from our second chapter that has to do with risk, right? When you're performing risk management, when you're looking at risk, you're looking at what kind of an environment do you have? What are you required to do? Maybe you have a great business environment, but you're required to do nothing. And let's flip that. Maybe you're required to do something because it's medical records and there's a HIPAA law. And if you don't protect medical records electronically, you could find $50,000 and there's a 5-year jail sentence for each mistake. And that's a thing. Okay. So that would be a game changer when you're looking at risk. So these are components of risk management. That's the only answer here that ties into that. Okay. If you said understanding the external content, that doesn't really fit the scenario based on the references we have and the reading in the textbook. Any questions about this item?
No question.
Okay. True false item tripped up a number of students. It is best to establish defense in depth by implementing components for the perimeter closest to the public internet. No, 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 no. I did like handsprings and cartwheels and backflips in the classroom. And I'm like, I showed you a picture. Remember that diagram of defense in depth when we're looking at info security management and cyber security management? I said defense in depth, and there was all these layers of things. And I said, most people make the mistake of starting where? On the perimeter. Where should they start? Inside. No one should have all their stuff together on one internal network. No one. If you have anything that matters, if you have assets to protect, you remember we were talking about, hey, do you want all your students on the wireless in the same network with the financial network and the financial aid? Does that ring a bell?
Yeah.
Okay. See, people they have a tendency to think in throw money at it kind of terms. It's like, oh, okay, so you want us to open our wallets and say, and just write a check, and we'll buy a big nasty firewall to put out on the perimeter to protect our network. No, that's the worst mistake everyone makes. Always. They always start out on the public internet, and they go to these conferences, and the big firewall providers give away lots of free stuff. So if you go to Vegas or Atlanta or Miami for a technology conference, those are a lot of fun. That's what they do, but that's not where you start defense in depth. The best, it's the foundation upon which your house, everybody knows that you can't, I'm going to borrow from scripture. Would that offend anyone if I did that? Or is it okay for me to do that?
I don't think it would offend anyone.
Okay. Everybody's heard of building the house on sand? What's your foundation for defense in depth? You start inside the fort, because ultimately when an attack is really bad, that's all you got left. The rest of this will all blow away, and the only thing that's going to save you is what's inside the fort. I did tell you about the ransomware where the CFO was attacked, yeah? Didn't I share that example recently?
Yeah, you shared it.
Okay. Do you know why that didn't get anywhere other than the CFO's desktop? Because the defense in depth didn't start on the perimeter. It started inside the fort. Segmented networks. Segmented, isolated networks. We have a separate VLAN, a separate virtual local area network designated for finance people only. So this nasty dragon popped up and it was only able to munch and crunch one desktop, and that's as far as it got. So, all right. There we go. Next item, another true false question. The operational plan documents of the organization's intended long-term direction and efforts for the next several years. Operational plan documents the organization's intended no, that would be the strategic plan or the like risk management framework or blueprint. Those are the things that map out years and years and long-term direction. Operational plans are what you're doing day to day in a routine. Okay. How do you operate on a daily basis? So here you're operating day to day. Years down the road, you're looking at the strategic interests. Okay, we're going to go wireless and we're going to have cellular gadgets that our sales crew is going to carry out to the umbrellas on the beach so we can sell our wares with folks who are here off the cruise ships, right? And that's a strategic direction. It's like, okay, instead of having a little shack to the side, we're going to have roaming service folk that provide our wares to customers. They don't have to lift a finger, right? That would be a strategic thing. That's just a quick example. I'm going to start moving and talking faster. And if you have a question, I need you to say something, okay? And we had some stuff in chat. Okay, yeah, we're good. A third true false. Yeah, true false is usually pretty straightforward, but we got stung on true false. Guidelines are detailed statements of what must be done to comply with policy. Yeah, detailed statements of what must be done to comply with policy is the definition of another type of document. Does anyone know what we're talking about here?
Standard.
Standards is correct. When you follow the standards, you are complying with a policy and meeting the requirements, legal or local, right? So standards are, now the guidelines are references, related references on how to execute those standards, right? Any questions? All right. This true false, no problem. Everybody got this correct? And so we'll keep moving. Multiple choice. Risk blank is the application of security mechanisms to reduce the risks to an organization's data and information systems. So the correct answer is treatment. Risk treatment, think controls. Security controls together collectively are often referred to as a risk treatment, okay? And security controls may not necessarily be technological in nature. They may be something like, okay, we're going to have audits and we're going to inspect the logs on the system. And the auditor is going to look at that, and that's an operational control, right? And it's still a security control, but it's more like people reviewing things. Treatment. Any questions about this? Okay, moving right along. Mechanisms. Risk blank. Oh, did I do that? I just did that one. Sorry. I calculate governance definition. Did I skip this? I think I skipped this one. Which of these best defines information security governance? The correct answer is the application of the principles and practices of corporate governance to the information security function. So that's the correct answer. And it's in there in the slides, should be in the study guides or slides or reading or all the above. Shift risk. The blank risk treatment strategy attempts to shift risk to other assets, other processes, or other organizations. Whenever you're trying to shift or deflect risk outside of your organization, you're trying to transfer that. You're not defending against risk. You're not mitigating or reducing risk. You're not accepting risk. You're transferring it out. Any questions about this item? All right, we're almost done. What physical network components are implemented for defense in depth in a perimeter network? Select all that apply. So this is where the diagram came in, right? You have a router with ACLs, that's access control lists, right? DMZ with DNS, a stateful firewall, and proxy. Now, a stateless firewall is a legacy firewall, first generation, dumb, stupid firewall, first implementation. It's like, has anyone ever heard of the curse of a version 1.0 software?
No.
Okay. It's rumored in technology, and I've known this for 25 years now, for a quarter of a century. People say never buy a version 1.0 software, ever. Just don't, because it's cursed. Version 1.0 software means, yeah, you're the guinea pig. You're their learning curve, right? The developers of that software package, it's their first round of customers, and tag, you're it, and you're helping them refine their software. The same thing is true of firewalls. The original firewalls were kind of dumb, and so the term stateless would mean unaware. A stateful firewall means that it's aware of what protocols are supposed to be using which ports. It's aware of the context. So if port 80 for a website is presenting packets that have nothing to do with a website, the stateful firewall will go into overtime and block that, right? A layer 3 core switch is in the internal network at the foundation level inside the fort. It's not on the perimeter on the outside. That's why that one isn't. Okay, and a lot of students chose that one. But perimeter is outside facing the internet. This is inside internal with subnets. Private subnets with local DNS, that has to do with the defense in depth, in same idea. That's inside the fort. Any questions about this one? This was a really good question. It goes back to that picture. Does everybody know about the picture I'm talking about? The picture? the diagrams?
The defense in depth diagram.
Yes, the defense in depth diagram, yes. Okay, let's see if we can do these in 30 seconds each. How's that? Everybody with me? And then we're done.
Yeah.
All right. Initial, so here's a multiple choice. Risk blank is the identification, analysis, and evaluation of risk as initial parts. The key word there is initial. Initial parts of risk management. Well, the first step for risk management, one of the early steps or stages of risk management is to assess your risks, right? Identification would probably come before that, but then you assess. So you identify the risk, then you assess. Control comes after, management comes after. Nobody fell for this one, risk management. Yeah, well, that would be a circular definition. Anyway, assessment. When you evaluate, analyze, and identify, and see, why is identification not the answer? Well, it's already stated here. So it's like risk identification is the identification. That's another circular definition. In terms of the question, does that make sense? You don't want
Yes.
to, yeah, you don't want a circular definition. Watch out for the circular traps, the snares, quicksand. Risk blank defines the quantity and nature of risk that organizations are willing to accept as they evaluate the trade-offs between perfect security and unlimited accessibility. Yeah, that would be the appetite. So how much tension an organization is willing to accept with trade-offs, that's the risk appetite. In some circles, you'll see risk tolerance used instead of appetite. And in our final version of the assessment, we might switch that to be tolerance, just for a little better clarity there. All right, here we go. Next to last. The blank risk treatment strategy attempts to eliminate or reduce any remaining uncontrolled risk through the application of additional controls and safeguards. That's mitigation. So you recognize, oh, I have a risk here. I'm going to try to control it with safeties and controls. That's mitigation. That's literally the definition of mitigation. And one last one. Here we go. Blank controls address personnel security, physical security, and protection of production inputs and outputs. Now, when you have a factory and you're operating the factory, you're performing production activities, and there are materials that go into the factory and there are products that come out of the factory. Raw materials are the inputs and finished products are the outputs. And that's a factory that produces. Does that make sense? So when a factory is operating, when a factory is actively taking inputs and producing outputs, it's said to be an operation. Factory is operating. So I'm just deep processing that to maybe help with the next round. You see that item, okay? Any questions? Okay. Well, I think I've extended your deadline for the module 2 solution. Since some of you were scrambling to juggle the assessment and the solution, you have a little more time to finish and get the latest solution in. I just thought I'd mention that before we close. thank you for joining us today, our module 2 item analysis. Are there any questions before we close for the day?